Hello, my name is Terrance, and this is my clinic on why O-Scale. I first gave this clinic at the 2018 O-Scale National Convention. In it, we're going to talk about what O-Scale 2-rail is and why you may want to consider it as your scale in the hobby. During this presentation, we are going to use the convention of O-Scale, meaning O-Scale models on 2-rail track, and we will use the convention O-Gauge to designate O-Scale nominal sorta kinda models on 3-rail track. So let's get started. So this is the agenda we're going to cover today. Why O-Scale? What is 2-rail O-Scale? We're going to do a little bit of O-Scale history, but then we're going to get down to the core of the presentation, which is debunking O-Scale myths. And then at the end, we're going to have some resource slides if you should choose to pursue this further. Here's my slide on why O-Scale. Now, I did this as a parody of Monty Python's Australian Philosopher's skit. So if you haven't seen that, look it up. It's on YouTube. It's a very funny skit, and that's what I'm parodying here. But basically, the reason for O-Scale is the mass and the realism of the models. They're larger in size. They're easier to see and manipulate, and a lot more room for putting on detailed parts. Greater opportunity for super detailing. There is no reason number 6. If you watch the Monty Python skit, you'll get the reference. There's also more room for electronics and dead rail batteries, and this is a decided advantage over the smaller scales. And you have RTR and DCC equipped models that make it easy to get started in 2-rail O-Scale. So what is 2-rail O-Scale? Well, O-Scale is about the third most popular scale for scale models. Remember, we mentioned we're not talking about 3-rail models here, which are not all the time scale models. So O-Scale is the third most popular scale for scale models. In the United States, O-Scale is commonly today 1/4 inch to the foot and 1 1/4 inch gauge. Now we recognize that the gauge is wrong. It's 5 feet, not 4 feet 8.5 inches. We'll see on a subsequent slide there are ways to address that. But other than that, O-Scale is like everything else. We use DC, DCC, and dead rail as control systems. Locomotives, structures, everything is available. You will have to look for it, but it is available. And there are publications, forums, and communities of 2-rail O-Scale modelers who are very high level and thriving, even though our numbers are not large. This next slide shows where O-Scale fits within the spectrum of scales from Z to G. It's the second largest commonly available model railroading scale on this side of the Atlantic. Now there are other scales that are not shown on this chart, but these are the ones that are commonly available. So O-Scale is proportion of 1 to 48 running on 1 1/4 inch gauge track. And it is, again, I say, second in size, subject only to G scale. O-Scale has referred to many different things at many times and in different places. This slide is an attempt to quantify some of those. So we're going to start out with O-tin plate or O-gauge running on 3-rail track. The proportions, it's not exactly to any scale. The proportions will vary, and therefore the ratio will vary. So the ratio of 1 foot equals, well, something, okay? The track gauge is 1 1/4 nominal, all right, like the rest of domestic U.S. O-Scale. In the UK, however, O scale refers to a scale of 7 millimeters to the foot. There, that creates a ratio of 1 to 43.5. It also runs on 1.25" gauge track, but in that case, at 7 millimeters to the foot, it's 4 feet 6 inches. Still an error, but not as large an error as 5-foot gauge. And of course, it uses 2 rail. In the US, O scale is typically, as we've said, 1/4 inch to the foot for a ratio of 1 to 48, running on 1.25" track, which is 5-foot gauge, and 2 rails. Now, one of the ways you can address the gauge error is to raise your proportions to 7/64ths of an inch to the foot. That gives you a proportion of 1 to 45, and then the gauge, 1.25" gauge, works out exactly to 4 feet 8.5 inches. And again, it's on 2 rail. Now we get into the narrow gauges, ON2, ON3, and ON30. All 1/4 inch to the foot, all share the same 1 to 48 proportion, but their track gauge is exact at 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and 5/8 of an inch. Now we should point out that ON30 is sort of a hybrid. It's a combination of O scale trains running on HO gauge track, which gives you a track gauge of 30 inches. Now, there aren't many narrow gauge 30-inch railways in the world, but there are some, so you can't call it a total foobie. One of the other ways you can correct the gauge error is to actually, well, change the gauge. That's alternately been called Q gauge, 1/4 inch AAR, but the current term is Proto 48. It again uses 1/4 inch to the foot, a ratio of 1 to 48, but it corrects the track gauge to 1.177 inches, which scales out to exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches, and it's on 2 rail. Now, on this slide, the names you see highlighted in yellow, USO scale, OM30, and Proto 48, are what you're liable to encounter today. As I said, 17/64 was done in the past. It's unlikely you're going to see it today. And if you're in the United States, you're unlikely to see UK O scale, but there is some of it here. A little O scale history. Back in the day, O scale was the dominant scale because you had large motors, you didn't have a lot of manufactured items for model railroading, and scratch building favored O scale. In the post-World War II manufacturing boom, it became easier to make smaller motors, smaller detail parts, and modeling shifted from making everything yourself towards buying and assembling pre-made kits and parts and such like. The demographics also favored the smaller scales in that you had the Levittown style home, which had a small basement, so the smaller scales was favored. O scale was not helped by the fact that we did not get plastic injection molded models until the 70s. Whereas the other smaller scales had had those for probably 2 decades at that point. But when we did, we went from some very simplistic models to the Intermountain 1937 boxcar, which is today even absolutely exquisite. However, time moved on, and a number of manufacturers got out of O scale, including the aforementioned Intermountain. But 3-railers came to the rescue with the demand for scale size and scale detailed 3-rail models, which are now easily converted to 2-rail. So while we have lost some, we've also gained, and O scale is still a very, very viable part of the model railroading hobby. Now we come to the kernel of the presentation. Everything you know or have been told about O-scale is a myth. What are some of these myths? Well, first, that there's no O-scale equipment available. You have to scratch build everything. This one is sort of forgivable because if you go down to your local hobby shop, you're not going to see anything O-scale. You may see a lot of O-gauge because that's very popular, but you're not going to see two-rail O-scale. A corollary to this is you can't model the prototype in O. Also not true. Another myth is O-scale requires an aircraft hangar size space for a good layout. This is also mythology, because you can get a perfectly good switching layout in 32 square feet. And I'll show that an example of that further on. And you can have 3 trains mainline running, switching in an 8 by 16 foot modular layout like the one Jim Cantor has built. And we're going to see a picture of that further on in the presentation. Final myth is O-scale is expensive. This is also not true, and it seems to be getting less expensive by the day, and we'll talk about that subsequently as well. Let's look at some of the recent modern major R&R and kit manufacturers. Now, we're not talking here about models made back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. While those are still available, let's just focus in on manufacturers using modern manufacturing techniques, producing models that compare favorably to models in any other scale. So we have Atlas, which is the same Atlas of HO fame. We have Intermountain, which is the same Intermountain of HO and N scale fame. We have K-Line, Lionel, and MTH have all recently produced 3-rail models to scale proportions and with scale levels of detail that are easily convertible to 2-rail. We have Red Caboose, also well known in the HO community, who at one time produced O-scale models. We have Sunset Third Rail, who imports models from the Orient. And we have Weaver, who was part of bringing plastic injection molded models to O-scale. Of the manufacturers you see on this screen, only the ones in yellow are still producing O-scale models. That doesn't mean that you can't get the models produced by the other manufacturers shown in white. Those models are still readily available on auction websites and on swap meets and on specific O-scale internet groups. Also, the Red Caboose and the Intermountain molds are still in use by Atlas, and the Weaver molds are in use by both Atlas and Lionel, of all people. So, what is available? Every type of locomotive or rolling stock that you could conceivably want has been made available in most materials, plastic, die-cast, brass, from the manufacturers at one time or another. And this slide just illustrates some of the things that have been available. It's not an exhaustive list. Plus, not listed here are what has been imported in brass, and what is available from resin and wood kit manufacturers to this day. Now, when we talk about die-cast hoppers here, we're not talking about the crude hoppers of Lionel's post-war period, but we're talking about die-cast that can many times rival brass in its level of detail. For instance, I have some Lionel die-cast hoppers that are absolutely beautiful. I love them. They have see-through brake platforms and see-through roof walks, and they compare favorably to brass, and they're relatively easily converted to 2-rail. Now, as to the individual models that have been produced, I'm using Weaver here as an example. And this isn't a complete list of everything Weaver produced, but you can see there are models here for the transition era or the modern modeler. And if you look down in the lower right and at the end of the first column, you'll see things like the Milwaukee ribside boxcar, the B&O wagon top boxcar, PRR H30 hoppers that are railroad specific models. So if you can get models that are unique to a single railroad, you can model accurately prototype railroads in O scale. But basically, this is just what Weaver produced. We're looking only at one manufacturer, and it's quite an array of models. Which is a good segue to our slide on prototype modeling. Yes, you can model the prototype in O scale. You can model most major railroads in many, many different eras. Why major railroad? We're talking Pennsylvania, New York Central, Union Pacific. Do you know how many Union Pacific big boys have been done in O scale? It's more than I can count. Same thing goes for GG1s, okay? So it is possible to model the prototype, but you're not limited to the major railroads. You can model many, many obscure roads. For instance, the Maryland and Pennsylvania was very popular at one time. However, you can't just buy this stuff down at your local hobby shop. You're going to have to haunt the auction websites, swap meets, and the O scale specific lists. But everything that has been made in O scale is still available today. You will have to wait for it to come up for sale, but you can get it, and you can model the prototype in O scale. And part of the reason for this is because, like everybody else in model railroaders, O-scalers have a fully stocked hobby shop in their basements. And they have more equipment than they're ever going to use. And, again, like most model railroaders, they probably over their career in model railroading changed their focus 2 or 3 times. So they've either changed era, or they've changed railroad, or they've changed region. So they have a lot of equipment that's surplus. And this equipment that shows up on auction websites and swap meets, and oftentimes it's dirt cheap. As I said on the previous slide, almost everything ever made in O scale can be found new and unopened, but you're going to have to hunt for it, and you're going to have to wait. You can do O scale in a surprisingly small space. On the next slide, we'll see a 32 square foot switching layout, and we'll see a 8 by 16 foot layout where you can keep 3 trains going. You can run pretty decent sized locomotives, and has number 8 and number 10 turnouts. And if you want to do narrow gauge, you can do narrow gauge in O at the same track plan and in the same footprint as an HO scale layout. Here are the 2 track plans I promised you. On the left, you see an L-shaped 32 square foot switching layout that I designed. It is the equivalent of 1 sheet of plywood. You take a sheet of plywood, rip it into 5 19-inch sections, and arrange them like this. What it does make use of is something you don't see on this much on this side of the Atlantic. That's called a traverser. It's sort of a transfer table for cars and locomotives. You see that at each end of the layout, and it acts as a car source or sink to get cars on and off the layout. It's the beyond the basement concept. In the lower right, you see Jim Cantor's Proto 48 8 by 16 modular layout. You can keep 3 trains running on this layout. You can use modern diesels or their equivalent in steam locomotives. And it has number 8 and number 10 turnouts. So you needn't scrimp on realism and have a very, very tin plate-like layout. Now this layout breaks down into 4 pieces which can be leaned up against a wall and assembled in a one-car garage stall when you want to use it and put away otherwise. This picture was taken at the 2014 National Train Show in Cleveland as part of the NMRA convention there. O-scale is not expensive. You can get the 1970s plastic cars, which are about equivalent to the Athearn Blue Box kits of recent happy memory, and you can get those typically for $10 or even less at swap meets. More modern kits from Intermountain and Red Caboose, for example, can be had for $20, $25, sometimes even less. And these are unstarted kits, so if you have the urge to build a kit, have at it. Plastic diesels are also very reasonable, with a typical modern plastic diesel from Atlas going for, say, $400, maybe a little bit more from Sunset Third Rail. But if you're willing to find one on the secondary market, about $150 what you should expect to pay. Steam is still mostly brass, but if you're willing to take an older steamer with a lower level of detail, again, probably still in its original pristine brass format, untouched except maybe test run or run around in a circle a few times, you can have that probably in the $300 to $600 range, depending on which model you want. Here's a comparison of your average boxcar price for all of the readily available scales, Z, N, HO, and O. And if you look at this, you'll realize that there's quite a bit of overlap between the various scales in the terms of the price of the boxcar, and that on average you're probably going to pay $5 to $10 more for the O-scale car, and that is a reasonable trade-off for you're getting a bigger car with much more detail applied, and you're going to enjoy it a whole lot more. And as John Armstrong pointed out, you'll probably need fewer of them. You know, a O-scale layout with 500 boxcars is unusual. Yes, people do have them, but they're very, very unusual. Not so in HO or N. Three-rail conversions is another way to get into O-scale very inexpensively. The three-rail community now has scale-sized and scale-detailed cars, which are readily convertible to O-scale by changing wheel sets and or the couplers. These are two K-line cars that I've converted by adding scale wheel sets and scale couplers. The one on the left is as I converted it, and the one on the right has been weathered. Now, the one on the right is probably not going to win any contests, but it's a perfectly acceptable car for the layout. In fact, it looks pretty darn good to me. Okay, so this is another way to get into O-scale very inexpensively. What else do you need to build a layout in O-scale? Well, you need things like track and turnouts and crossing, power and control. And this slide attempts to address those sundries you need to build a layout. And O-scale is not too much different from any other scale. In fact, we use the same suppliers for scenery and the same suppliers for power and control systems as the other scales. We have flex track, we have ready to run or hand laid or make it yourself turnouts and crossings. Structures, we have plenty. Details, we also have plenty, and we're going to look at those in the resource slides at the end of this presentation. But you can build a layout in O-scale without having to go and make everything from scratch. So what can we say in summary? O-scale is like every other scale. You have models, you have sundries, It's not expensive, it need not take up much space, and you can accurately model the prototype in O scale. But you're going to have to work a little harder to find the models. You're going to have to work a little harder to integrate the whole model railroad. But O scale, bottom line, is better for tired eyes and unsure hands, and we all get there at some point in our lives. I want to say thank you for listening to this presentation, and don't go away because this will be followed by several slides of resources. I'm not going to narrate those slides, but I will put them up on the screen so you know where to go look if you want to follow up on some O-scale resources. So thank you. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.